Thank you everyone for joining us today for our BJSS webinar, Is the Agile Manifesto Still Fit for Purpose? We are recording today's session and we do want it to be as interactive as possible. We don't have the chat functionality available, but please do send in any hellos, comments, or of course questions using the Q&A functionality. We have got Mario, who's on hand to be a translator for any Agile jargon or acronyms that people may not be aware of. So hopefully it will work. We'll try it out. He will be sending it through the Q&A and then I will make that live to the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David to introduce today's session.
Lovely, thank you, Karen. Right, yeah, so today's session we're going to be talking about the Agile Manifesto and trying to answer the question, is the Agile Manifesto still fit for purpose? Just in terms of a running order, we'll do a quick introductions before we get started, so you get the opportunity to meet the team. Then we're going to sort of run through, get a little bit of context. So, you know, why are we talking about the Agile Manifesto? And then sort of try and answer a few questions around people's experiences with it. So what were people trying to achieve when they looked at the Agile Manifesto and tried to adopt these new ways of working? What challenges have they faced when they've been on this journey? And then sort of, you know, come back to the question really around whether there is a need for a sort of an Agile Manifesto 2.0, and if there is, you know, what sort of things would it cover? And then we'll also look at the question of external support and how useful that is in for clients on their journey towards adopting these new ways of working. Just to start off with a few introductions. So we'll start with me since I'm talking anyway. My name's David Smith. I'm an Agile coach. I work with BJSS. I've been working with BJSS for a little over a year, but I've been doing Agile coaching for a number of years. And really I see my role as being helping to help organizations deliver value to their customers. If I can hand over to Emma.
Hi everyone, my name's Emma Rossiter. I'm a delivery manager based out of the London office. I'm also the lead for the delivery management team in London. I've been with BJSS for about 7 years now.
Lee, if you'd like to go next.
Cool, thank you. So I'm Lee White. I'm head of delivery at BJSS, based out of our Nottingham office. I've been with BJSS for about 4.5 years now. So in addition to my head of delivery role, I also am an Agile delivery consultant.
Thank you. And Seb.
Sebastian Bonicel. I am a delivery manager in the Midlands. I also lead the delivery manager or management capability for the Midlands. I've been at BJSS for a couple of years. And I've had various career moves as a Scrum Master, Agile coach, Agile evangelist, let's call it.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, just to sort of confirm, we work for this company BJSS, which is a leading technology and engineering consultancy for business. We sort of pride ourselves on being trusted by our clients, and we collaborate with them to deliver complex and innovative technology and engineering solutions that are actually used by millions of people every day. So we've rolled those out across a number of organizations in government and in the private sector. And as the map shows, we have offices all around the UK, and we're headquartered in Leeds, but we have offices all around the UK, as well as an international presence in the US and most recently in Lisbon. So let's start with a little bit of context. So as many of you will be aware, back in 2001, there was a group of, well, what one of the delegates actually described as 17 middle-aged white guys who got together at a ski resort in Snowbird in Utah and came up with this Agile Manifesto. And this was really in response to the fact that there was a sort of an increasing realization that people and organizations were struggling to get their software delivered. So a lot of money, a lot of time and a lot of effort was being invested in software delivery, and frequently by one or other measure, those deliveries were unsuccessful. So this group of individuals came together to form this framework, which was values-based, which they believed would help organizations on this road to delivery. So having come up with this, a lot of organizations have tried to adopt this new way of working. And, you know, they've been tempted by this sort of promise of better quality software, delivery to their customers more quickly, this highly motivated, very happy workforce, all sort of combining to make this quite a tempting prospect for them in their sort of in their business context. And so there's been a lot of organisations who've tried on this journey, and there's been a lot of support for them. So there's lots of sort of ways in which you can learn about this. There are meetups, there are conferences, books. One book in particular stands out as being a good example. You can get certifications, and also there are lots of articles, lots of blog pieces, lots of information available. And I think, sort of finally, finally Agile finally arrived in the Harvard Business Review back in about May 2016. So we knew then that it had really sort of taken a hold. Well, probably knew before then, but we knew then that this sort of HBR had recognised it as a thing, and so it was this sort of thing as a sort of this new way of working. But I think there is a sort of recognition, and you can see this in each of these forums, that it is not straightforward. So changing your ways of working is not an easy thing to do. So we're here today to discuss that and discuss whether the manifesto helps with that adoption of these new ways of working, and whether it's still fit to address the challenges that organisations face today. So with that context set, I guess we should start at the beginning. So the sort of first question is, I think, what do we think that clients or organisations are trying to achieve when they are embarking on this agile journey in terms of changing their ways of working? What do they want to get out of it? There's a few examples on the right hand side, and I don't know if any of the panel would sort of say that these are things that resonate with them, or whether there's other elements as well.
Yeah, so I'll go first. So certainly from my experience over the past kind of 10 or so years working with clients, I would say that the majority of the kind of end states that clients are wanting to achieve, for me, and in my experience, as I say, is around speed of delivery to market, especially in these highly competitive times with lots of startups clamoring for people's businesses, especially in the larger enterprises. They're looking to become more nimble and get away from their kind of lethargic governance states that they currently have, and looking to get new innovative products to market as quickly as possible to maintain and grow their market share. That's certainly one of the major elements I see. And the other ones are around people who have kind of dabbled and dipped their toe into the kind of agile space and found that they've got themselves into a bit of a pickle around their delivery processes and or their quality of their deliverables that they're putting out, because they've maybe not put the rigor around that some of the agile practices need in place in order to make sure you are maintaining the quality, both from a technical and a process perspective. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Sure. Any other thoughts?
I think some of the things I've seen for businesses are that they really want greater transparency around what's being delivered. So I think previously when we were delivering in a waterfall types of way, you didn't really know what you were getting until pretty much the very end of it. So I think it's useful for the business to see progress as they're going, having that constant feedback loop into them, showing progress, things like that are definitely things that they're looking for. And I think also being able to respond and change is a big thing for businesses as well. As Lee was saying, markets are changing quite rapidly. Companies need to be very responsive, and working in an agile way really helps companies to align better with that, I think. Certainly much more so than the old waterfall delivery ways.
That visibility point is quite interesting, because there's 2 elements to that, I think, aren't there? One of the elements is, as you say, you can put the product in front of the customer on a sort of more regular basis, so they have sight of the changes that you make, and any and there's an opportunity there for them to provide feedback. But I think there's also a visibility from the point of view of, I mean, we're all quite used to, or we all were quite used to, the sort of the monthly RAG status report on project updates, and that quite often was painted a fairly favourable picture for a large portion of the project until it sort of approached delivery, at which point it would start to go amber and red. And I think in an agile context, I think the metrics that that we use tend to be a bit more real world. And as a result, it's a sort of a better representation of the reality of what's going on with the project. And that can be quite helpful for decision making and making choices about what you want to do next and what you want to stop doing and start doing.
I think we need to also recognize that there's been an evolution in the last 19 years of the goals for clients or indeed for individual organization using the Agile Manifesto or the Agile with a big A. An evolution from the original intention of the manifesto as specifically around software to a gradual increase of how do we do agility at an organizational level. So now if you look at goals of why people use this approach, is really targeted at a multi-layer view of the world. The business aligning to IT, it's not just a microcosm of a single Scrum team, it's multiple Scrum teams and how they fit in a bigger portfolio sense, to try to understand the bigger picture. And so that goal has changed and has evolved. Are we getting better by using this manifesto and the principles in it? That is a big question. Is that manifesto enough to be able to cater for that goal change, evolution? That's probably part of what we're trying to answer today.
Yeah, I think we might want to come back to that in a little bit, and whether it is indeed enough. But I think you're right. I think there's this notion of Agile can be applied beyond software, and I think it has been applied beyond software in a number of instances now. And I think when we were talking earlier, Lee, you mentioned that for example, we have our design studio in Spark, and whilst they use a lot of the Agile techniques in terms of close collaboration with the customer, short feedback loops, driving changes, and really sort of using that as a way of sort of getting something in front of a customer quickly and being able to launch, to put something live quickly. They're actually looking at stuff such as service design, strategy, and potentially not writing any code at all.
Correct, and that's right. It's an increasing trend that's been happening for about the last 5 or 6 years, I would say. Certainly, if you catch up on any of the latest kind of thinkings around, for example, Scrum. Scrum is used in all kinds of industries now, not just software. So schools, broadcasting, all kinds of industries are adopting it as a way to tackle problems and to deliver value in whatever form that may come. That may be news stories, it may be educational outcomes, those types of things. So it's been seen as a really good way to both visualize work state and to make sure you are making those incremental steps towards the goal you're trying to achieve, right? And we'll probably get onto this a little bit later on. The manifesto itself is focused on software, so no spoilers there, but we'll get around to that.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean, I think it's well known. It was born out of software, but as we say, we've seen more wider adoptions of it since.
I think it probably is worth calling out as well. So that middle point that we've got on there around aligning business and IT, that is a particular kind of issue we see in lots of the larger enterprises that we work with, where you do have the idea of the business and then the IT, the delivery people. Anyone who's read the Phoenix Project will kind of, have one of those aha moments where they'll recognize the characters and the behaviors from that particular book. And, it's designed as a kind of caricature of it, but so many of those behaviors are real. What we see in clients and that kind of collaborative aspect and bringing everyone together to that common goal is something that's really critical. And it probably is something that, when we get to talking about the manifesto, we'll be able to pick up a little bit more.
Yeah, that collaborative element, that mindset shift, if you like, towards that collaboration is really sort of key. Okay, all right. So we got a sort of an understanding. So we're talking about these themes of improved responsiveness, being able to adapt to change, getting better collaboration in your organization, and getting better visibility of the work that's going on, either in terms of the product, and also in terms of how it's reported and seen by the rest of the organization. So that sounds great, right? This is all super stuff. So So what stops people doing it? You know, what are the obstacles? What challenges have clients faced in terms of being able to achieve those goals?
If I may just kind of go in directly there, I mean, just personal experience as a delivery manager, would go into an engagement which is usually very specific about a particular project. We go into the client context. We organize a single team or a couple of teams, and we're told, okay, you've been brought in to help us with the ways of working. Just tell us what good agile looks like. Just do it. And you know, more often than not, we are successful at this. And then at some point, you get to a place where you need to talk about budgeting, and then you need to talk about getting more people out from the BAU teams, or you're about to do a release, and then you start to hit some of the big blockers of an organization that is just focusing on one part and trying to do that well. That is one of the key obstacles that we've seen, the scaling of not the size of what is happening, but the scaling of the concept applied to a particular team and how that team fits in the bigger picture. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we very much see that separation between teams, and I think a lot in terms of governance process within companies as well. So you have teams doing Agile, or you know, doing Scrum, doing Kanban, all these different things, and it works well until you get to that stage where, as we say here, that you have those funding cycles and those governance gates, and you have to have ticked off a number of documentation boxes and a number of different things before you can actually progress through that, which in an Agile world, you're not actually producing that kind of collateral. So you're kind of stuck trying to wedge what you're doing into a very waterfall type of process, which just doesn't work. And trying to get companies to get to the stage where their financial models actually support what we're doing in an Agile way is really, really difficult, because budget cycles are set, you know, quite once a year. We kind of get together, we put together our project budgets and we review them as we go through, but it's not a case of, you know, maybe how we would do it with an Agile way of doing things is that every few months you'd review what have you gotten out of your project so far, and actually make those hard decisions about should you continue the project or should you kill it. Nobody likes to kill projects. So, but that is one of the benefits of Agile, is that you can see how well or badly the project is going quite early on and make those kind of critical decisions, but not if you're trapped into those kind of very waterfall types of funding cycles.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that we see quite commonly is an underestimation of the size and scale of what needs to happen to become an Agile organization. Overlaying Scrum on top of your development department, for example, as we kind of mentioned there, does not necessarily mean that you've gained all the benefits of becoming an Agile organization. It's a fundamental mind shift that needs to take place to truly get the benefits in all aspects of your business, you know, that kind of lean startup thinking. So there's a kind of a letting go of that command and control mentality and that cascade of needs and requirements from the top down to teams, leaving just the doers to implement the will of the directors or whomever it may be. Enabling those teams to have that kind of idea of self-organization and empowerment to make decisions at the kind of the grassroots where the work actually happens is critical. And it's a really difficult thing when you've got that entrenched way of working within your organization and those cultural elements as well that go along with that, to kind of almost let that go and put the trust in the people who are doing the work to kind of imagine that work and to create it and then to deliver it in collaboration with everyone. And that's a pretty fundamental thing. You're actually turning the whole organization upside down and reversing the way the work happens. But a lot of organizations plug in Scrum and expect that to work. And then we start hitting those obstacles that Seb mentioned of, you know, when you try to release a thing, or when you try to get approval to spend some more money because you've understood a really great way to add more value to the organization. So it's a really difficult thing, and the underestimation of quite what you're taking on when you try to transform your organization to this way of working is one of the things we commonly see.
Yeah, I think around that self-organization piece and empowerment of people within the company, that's a huge cultural shift. And I think definitely one of the obstacles I've seen in a number of companies is that when you get down to the grassroots level, if people haven't had that culture before where they have been empowered to make decisions and they've been allowed to fail, they've been allowed to make mistakes and, you know, make changes as a result of that. And I think that's a really key thing. A lot of the time, companies punish people for failure, but actually failure up early and you know, early days in the project is actually a good thing, right? Because we're learning from our mistakes and we make improvements and we change things.
Absolutely.
Coming to that later on, you know, whereas before we would have found the failures all towards the end, which is when everything starts to go red, not such a good thing. But I think one of the cultural issues that we face then with the teams is there's a reluctance to self-organize sometimes, that they don't feel empowered, they feel they'll be blamed, they don't feel protected. It's easier to point to someone else and say, actually, I'm going to give my responsibility to you, you are in charge, and I prefer it that way because now I don't have to take that responsibility and accept any consequences that might come out of that. So I think there is a bit around that in how do we make that cultural change to make people feel comfortable with self-organization and the empowerment and the level of responsibility that brings.
I think a lot of it is coming down to that leadership and what leadership means in the kind of modern way of delivering things. It needs to be a different kind of leadership. It's an inspirational, empowering leadership rather than a telling leadership. And you know, that's where, you know, having the people who are leading organizations aware of how they should behave and how they should be with people is critical to that.
And there is maybe something that may be unpopular with people listening in, but you know, there is such a thing as common sense in the world of Agile. There are such things as Scrum, as DSDM, as DAD, as less, as safe. And these are all good and well-intentioned. But the reality is that one of the key obstacles of leadership buy-in is moving into a place where you are trying to do an Agile transformation, even if it's just you're trying to deliver a product using Scrum. These frameworks are not the answer to the question. They are not the answers to all the goals that you have in terms of delivering value quicker and delivering the right thing. They are only tools to get to that place. And one of the obstacles that we see is people we want to use safe, just land it, please. Well, the reality is what we are here to do is to talk about the mindset, to talk about how your people need to self-organize. And that is a really different kind of proposition, a different approach to thinking about how to resolve the challenges that our clients face. So we're mindful of complex structures in corporate context that are trying to do grand things. We're also mindful of the great advantages of delivering and using the principles that are outlined in the manifesto, how they scale up and down. But we also need to be mindful that common sense prevails. And that's really one of the best tools that we have to remove some of the obstacles that we have in front of us.
Yeah, that reliance on process was brought home to me actually just this week in a conversation with a client when the comment was that people in the organization are not failed or not, it's not failure to let your customer down. It is a failure to not follow the process. And there's a sort of it was quite a telling comment in the conversation in terms of how the organization operates and the culture within it. But that sort of reliance on frameworks is something that I think a lot of organizations do, and they expect Agile to provide another framework, another process for them to adhere to, rather than, as we've been saying, to really embrace the mindset change that is required to make this successful. So that's the sort of question of the mindset, the change in leadership, the move away from that reliance on process and frameworks, those sort of very structured approaches. I think those are all obstacles which are probably underestimated when client, and as you were saying as well, Lee, that sort of the sheer scale of the work and the scale of the change that they're taking on this journey. So I'm going to move us along a little bit again, and so based on all of that, the Agile Manifesto, do we think we need, do we think it needs a rewrite? Do we think it needs an update, a 2.0?
Yes.
Stunned silence.
Yes to all the questions. I think my view of this is that I absolutely believe that the Manifesto 1.0 still is valid. It was designed for a specific purpose, and at that level of granularity of a single team using a particular outcome, it has huge value. The principles still stand. I think we start seeing it creaking at the seams when we scale, when things and constraints are applied to the value that is trying to be delivered. And therefore there is a wider picture that has emerged, an evolution from the original intention, which was absolutely key and still valid 20-odd years later. But the reality is Agile with a big A has gone so much bigger. So whilst we can still apply the principles, their application in the real world may have changed, may have evolved, and therefore needs to be adapted.
I tend to disagree. So I think that the manifesto as it stands now, I think there are certain elements. So technology's moved along. We've been using these ways of working for 20 years now, and the way we use them has changed subtly. But I think the underlying principles and values stand the test of time, and I think if you see them as that, they will help you deliver software better. I think that the big question for me comes around whether you come up with a new manifesto for non-software delivery. So that's kind of a question for me. But with regards to the actual manifesto as it stands today, my concern would be if you adapted it to fit the new test automation or new approaches for platform or whatever it may be, you would make it much more brittle, and it would become more of a thing than it is, which for me is kind of beacon of hope for people to kind of strive towards without kind of making it too grandiose. It's things that you should be adhering to, and everyone will have their own interpretation of the way things should be done, and I think that's a good thing, rather than a prescriptive set of things that you should have. And I'm not suggesting for a second that's what Seb's saying there, but that's a long way of saying I think it's fine how it is. Thanks.
I think I agree that the Agile Manifesto, as it stands at the moment for software delivery, has stood the test of time remarkably well, given the amount of changes that have been going on over the past 20 years since it's been written. And the speed of change in technology is huge. So actually having something that's based on values rather than, as we were saying, anything particularly prescriptive is definitely a better way to do things. But I do also agree that given the ways in which Agile is now being applied in organizations and at an enterprise level and in different areas to software delivery, it's a bit of a struggle sometimes to apply some of those values necessarily in those different contexts and make them work. And sometimes it feels like you're trying to squeeze something into a shape, so round peg, square hole type thing, just to say it's Agile. And so I think I would agree that there's something there about, do we need a 2.0, which is not rewriting what we've had in the past for software delivery, and actually that continues as is. But given the way things are going now and where we're heading with taking Agile organization-wide, enterprise-wide, and outside software delivery, do we need a different version of the manifesto that is more applicable to those things? I think a lot of it might still stand, but yeah, there's other things it needs to consider, some of which are on that list there as well. But yeah, I think two versions maybe.
Yeah, I sort of I'm going to sit firmly on the fence here. I mean, I think there are I think the manifesto as it stands. I mean, if you accept the fact that if you have to substitute the word software for something else, so it's a service or a service and a product or something along those lines, so it's not quite so industry specific. I think the applications can be, it can be sort of broadened enormously, as we've alluded to, and you were saying, Lee, about it being in education and using design and all sorts. But I think there's elements of it, and some of them are listed here. I think that they are in there, but they're not as explicit as they could be. And I think that's perhaps one of the challenges I have with it. So, you know, I think the manifesto assumes that a product vision and an idea from a business is clearly understood and clearly articulated to a team who is then set the task of delivering it. And even failing that, the business is then available to clarify any questions that team may have. And in my experience, that's frequently not the case. And that sort of investment in effort in actually being really clear on what the team is being tasked to deliver using whatever framework is not clear enough. And we've talked a little bit about mindset. And the mindset element is in there. You know, you have individuals and interactions over processes and tools, but is it as explicit as it could be? You almost need it feels like you need a footnote saying, you know, NB, this includes mindset shift, to help you to help people understand the implications of it.
I think the individuals and interactions at a scale part is one of the challenges as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, that is obviously much easier when you've got a team that are co-located and we can all work together and there's room for everybody's voice and time to hear it and things like that. But when you scale that up and out, and also globally as well, most of us are working with I think everyone's working non-co-located these days, right? So, but in the past as well, it's like you'll have had Scrum teams based, you know, some in Europe, some in Asia, some in the US, and you're working across multiple time zones, and it's remote and it's challenging. And I think that sort of thing needs to be accommodated somehow as well. It's like, I mean, we definitely all do it, but you know, then how do you raise that interactions and individuals over process in that kind of area?
I think the danger from my perspective on taking some of those things to the kind of the next level is that it becomes an instruction manual rather than a manifesto. Yeah. And then it becomes, we were talking a little earlier about people implementing. So using Scrum, for example, there are some rules. If you read the Scrum guide, it will give you some practical steps to implement, to do a thing and implement a framework. There is no framework for the Agile Manifesto. That's not what it's designed to do. So if you apply more specificity to it, that's a really difficult word to say. It becomes more like an instruction manual and a guide than a guide. And that's where my kind of conflict comes around kind of adding more to it. However, there are elements that I do agree that, you know, like scaling, like making sure that the delivery meets the user needs. You have to squint a little bit at some of the values and principles to find those things. But I think that's where you overlay other elements to the delivery itself. Like, you know, if you're working in the public sector, the GDS standard, you know, those types of things, you know, and some kind of human psychology elements, you know, there are other tools you can overlay on top of the manifesto to allow you to get the delivery to where you need to be.
And I think that kind of brings us on potentially to the next slide, which there we go. One of the other things that you can bring to help sort of help organisations understand and interpret this is this sort of external support. So the idea of bringing agile coaching in as a way of sort of helping customers, helping organisations make those interpretations, I think. So it's sort of understanding what the implications are of those values and those frameworks. Has anybody got any thoughts on sort of agile coaching and how that can be beneficial or not?
I think this is one of the areas that is probably the least understood when it comes to the manifesto and its application. You know, let me just give you a specific example. If you have in your organization people who have had a go at running a Scrum team and they are a Scrum Master for 1 year and then there is a reorganization, and they've got a new title. It's called Agile Coach. Well, the reality is the manifesto itself, as we've kind of been discussing, is complex. It's simple in its design and its words, but in its application is really complex. The relational side, the collaborative side, how does that translate into not just a single team, as Emma alluded to, but into a multiple level kind of organization? How does the cultural element of that particular location, that particular company, actually fit into the interpretation and the application of those principles? And this is where an agile coach comes in. Not only do we want somebody who is knowledgeable about frameworks, because there are good things about those, experience of having been in the trenches, but also somebody who's able to understand, learn, and interpret the needs of that particular organization at that particular moment and make sense of that, make it real. That's really one of the key benefits of an agile coach. Yeah.
I think going back to what Lee was saying earlier on, it's the manifesto is a guideline. It's not anything prescriptive. And I think where organizations struggle is when they don't have that internal knowledge and experience and ability to run something that's a guideline rather than a process. That they want a process. They want something that they can standardize, deploy at scale, have everyone doing the same thing, following the same ways of working. It makes it much easier from an organizational perspective to do that. And I think that's why there's so many different models have popped up around Agile, because, you know, organizations want that. It's like, well, the guidelines are great, but I don't really know how to apply them. I don't really know what that means. What's the best way to do it? What are the challenges with that? And actually, how do I resolve those challenges? So having a prescriptive framework is much more effective. Well, is it effective? It's much more efficient for them. So, you know, they can deploy something like that, and then it should, if it succeeds or fails, it's based on, well, the framework maybe wasn't the right tool. But I think that's where the coaching comes in to its own. Again, it depends on the coach. It depends on the organization. You have to find a coach that suits the type of organization that you are, understands the challenges that you face and how to apply those. So, you know, that is part of the journey as well for companies.
I think from my perspective, there's a couple of facets to the agile coach role. So there's the initial kind of startup element to it. So organizations who are trying to move to you know, a particular agile way of working, you know, be that enterprise or departmental or whatever. So the investment in an experienced agile coach who can help them set up those ways of working and those delivery practices and make sure they are delivering that outcome is an investment that will protect their value stream and optimize it by hopefully preventing some of the common anti-patterns that people starting up with that way of working can experience, by having been there before, being able to spot the signs and steer them on the right path. So, I mean, there is an argument that organizations would want to be able to, as Emma mentioned earlier, fail fast and fail safely and learn their own lessons as they go. And that would be ideal. But in this fast-paced commercial world that we're in now, some of those failures are not acceptable. So it can be the case that investment in something like an agile coach can help prevent some of those failures and steer the organization in the right direction. And then the other facet that I find is that organizations who are operating in a way that would be deemed as agile need some optimization of their processes and practices in order to drive that continual improvement, because it can be a kind of a plateau kind of mentality where, oh, we're this good and why do we need to change now? Having someone there with the experience to turn a mirror on the organization and the practices therein to enable them to see how they could improve and to poke and prod a little bit and use the metrics and the data to display exactly what's going on within the organization to enable them to facilitate that change themselves is really where coaches kind of come into their own. So that for me, there are those two elements to coaching, which I think are really valuable to organizations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think the challenging thing, you're absolutely right. I mean, that is part of the role of the coach, is to constantly kind of hold the mirror up to the organisation and the individuals in it to examine what they're doing and can constantly look for better ways. And I think the other element as well, I think, is the leadership part, which is noted on there, is that engagement with the leadership to make. So I think it's frequently missed that the leadership need to be part of the change, and I think quite often leadership, because that's the way it's always worked. I mean, the change will happen to their guys, right, to their team, to their organisation, to their department, and they don't need to be part of it. And I think one of the key elements of the coaching role is to sort of go in and actually say to the leadership as well that they need to be part of this change. They need to sort of live this and embody this for their organisation to take it on as well. I'm a little bit aware of time, and I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions. So I'm just going to move it on and see if there are any questions that have come in. Karen, have you got anything there?
Yeah, I'm just going to stop you sharing your screen so we can see all the lovely panelists. So, if the Agile Manifesto was to be rewritten, who would write it?
Wow.
Ooh, I can imagine a crowdsourcing version of Agile Manifesto 2.0. This idea of having almost a worldwide attempt at doing something that we all agree on. Will that ever happen? Probably not, because with 2 billion people working in the space, or call it 20 million IT professionals in the Agile world, we would have 20 million version of it. But why not? Be creative.
Another one, you talked about scaling Agile as one area that isn't well covered in the Agile Manifesto. How would you approach taking single Scrum team delivery to multi-team delivery using the same principles? And what is practically missing from the manifesto to enable that?
Wowza.
Put you on the spot here.
So for me, that's definitely a question of organizational context, culture. It would have to be a tailored approach that matches those elements. It's a really difficult question. You obviously have things like the Scaled Agile framework out there, less Nexus, other kind of frameworks, and those are tools that can help you with those types of things, and it completely depends on what kind of organization you are, what you're trying to achieve, and how you want to get there as well. So I don't think I can really give you an answer other than it would be analyzing all of those things and finding the right tool for the job. You might even create your own kind of process to match if required. Don't know, Seb, if you have anything to add to that, or Emma.
No, so there's another one. How do you marry an annual finance cycle with an agile delivery cycle?
Wish I knew is the answer to that one. I've yet to see it done well. I think there's such a difference between the financial teams that I've come across and the IT way of delivering things in an agile framework that they don't marry particularly well. I actually think it needs a complete rethink of how finance is done to support agile processes, because it doesn't fit in with the standardized financial accounting practices, which I appreciate are incredibly well established, and people in finance don't particularly want to change those, because they are pretty painful, in fairness as well, for anyone who's had experience with them. At the moment, it seems to be trying to find ways that work best for you and for the organization that you're in. So just kind of understanding what they need from their financial teams and trying to work with that, I think a lot of the time I spend is working with the finance teams, trying to educate them in terms of what we can deliver and what we can't deliver for what they need, and trying to come to some sort of agreement and collaboration with them around how much will they accept from us, or how little will they accept from us in relation to what they need, and kind of take that as an ongoing work in progress. So that's been my experience.
I think one of the things I find around this, that you can get a degree of predictability around it, and you can operate within that construct of an annual financial cycle, is if you build self-organizing product-centric teams, you have a predictable unit in terms of cost, because you know how much it costs to run a team, and they have everything they need to do the job they need to do. So you know how much all of your teams will cost. And if you can adapt your thinking from project to product and adjust your workflow to be smaller so that it flows better, you can actually operate within an annual cycle, but review it quarterly or more often if you can, to divert your funds and the work to the areas of your value streams that are offering the most value to your organization. So it might be customer acquisition, or it may be customer retention, or it may be infrastructure upgrades, depending on the needs at that point in time. But you reduce your review cycle within your kind of cost envelope on a more regular basis throughout the year.
Yeah.
Have that predictability because you know how big your teams are and how much they cost. And what you're doing is changing the work and where it flows to and changing your funding according to that.
Yeah, I worked with a client where they did exactly that. So they reduced from annual to quarterly, and the aspiration was to make it shorter again. So it's sort of it's an iterative approach. It was an iterative approach they took, and I think it worked well in that context. But it was a sort of they would also reduce the overhead. So I think you mentioned, Emma, the finance process can be quite time consuming. So they worked actively to kind of reduce the overhead for a quarterly review as opposed to an annual one, because otherwise you're quadrupling your workload. Yeah, as I say, unfortunately at the time I left, they were still on quarterly, but I know they were looking to increase the frequency of that.
There's a couple actually around public sector. So how does government fit in an agile context? I think people have experienced some frustrations in this area. So how have we managed our public sector clients, given that their ways of working is maybe not in a particular agile way?
It's interesting you say that, because some of the best projects that I've worked on have been public sector projects. So all projects within government are digital by default now. They adhere to the Government Digital Service Standard, which are fundamentally aligned to Agile Manifesto principles. The government and government agencies and the public sector more widely are on a journey towards that. So there will be frustrations from people in certain deliveries along those lines. But if you think about what GDS, the Government Digital Service Standard, is trying to do, it's trying to protect the public purse by making sure we are having small incremental delivery of value and making sure we're delivering the right thing. Because if we are delivering the right thing and we know that sooner, we can stop the things that aren't right and protect public money. So underpinning all of that are many standards, as you'd expect, in how to work, which are based on the Agile Manifesto principles. So in actual fact, as I say, many of the best projects we work on are public sector projects. And I think,
Lee, what's probably worth adding here is that they're not just applied to software delivery. There is a service element to it. There is also a product element. There is a UX design element to that. So it is really an all-encompassing view of those principles and how they apply, which is impressive. Yeah.
And I think we've got time for just one more. So doesn't emergent architecture and requirements lead to Frankenstein systems and endless delivery?
Okay. So I think for me that's kind of a bit of a misinterpretation of the actual manifesto principle itself. So the kind of secret sauce I find within delivery is by involving teams in the formation of the work that delivers the service. So identifying those user needs and user requirements, if you will, and finding the optimal way to solve those problems. So for me, emergent architecture and emergent requirements doesn't mean it pops up willy-nilly throughout delivery. There's a degree of pragmatism that needs to be applied. Certainly our principles are solid architectural foundations up front to enable you to build for the future change. So it's about interpretation of that element of the manifesto rather than emergent as it just pops up and appears as you go through. It's, yes, you are going to find change, but you have to be building on a solid foundation from the start.
I think people are still on, so I've got time for just one more question. Does the Agile Manifesto need change to adapt to the new team roles which have emerged in the last 10 years, e.g. service designers, UXers, user researchers? And I mentioned this one because obviously something that we have with Spark. So what is everybody's thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question. I mean, this is really going back to the original intention of the manifesto. It is a set of principles. It isn't a role matrix applied to an organization. It's not there to do that. So there has been, and there will be in the future, even newer roles that will evolve and come into the world of delivering good things in the right way, at the right time. So I think you can translate that question in terms of, do we need new Scrum roles to adapt for UX designer? That is another question. Or do we need new roles in SAFe? But these are frameworks. The manifesto itself is a set of principles. And I think there is a clear distinction between those two things. There will be new roles and they will need to find a home. How do we use a good UX designer in the context of delivering what is right for the user within the cost constraint that we have? That is a valid question. But it's the set of principles. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, in my experience working with service design and user experience teams, I think that's actually fit in really well with Agile delivery. So it brings it into that product-focused, user-centric way of delivering things. And it puts much more emphasis on it. I think left to their own devices, software delivery teams, and I'll raise my hand for this one as well, we tend to focus on technology and not necessarily the user experience and the user requirement. So kind of having that front and foremost and having someone there who will hold you accountable to it and say, well, actually, no, this is what the research shows. This is what our design shows. This is how we develop this. I actually think the two marry really, really well together. So no, there isn't a formal role within maybe Scrum or any of those, but I think maybe there should be.
So I think we are coming to the end of the session. There are a few questions that we've not managed to get through, but I'm sure David and the team will be happy to follow up if I send them on. Is there anyone that'd like to add anything else before we close today?
Just for me, just to say, if you do want to ask any of those questions or any others, I recommend you join your local Agile meetups. They're a great source of information and a great opportunity to meet like-minded people. So do reach out to your local Agile communities.
And I will be sending a follow-up with the recording, so there'll be any links in there that anyone, if Lee, you've got any suggestions, I can put those in the follow-up email, not a problem. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed that session.